Texas summer 1944. A truck door slams, and before anyone sees her face, they smell her. The guard at the gate takes one breath and steps back. Not dramatically, just one half step, the kind a man makes when his body moves before his mind catches up. The medical officer standing at the intake table tightens his jaw. The Red Cross nurse near the door goes very still. And a 21-year-old German girl climbs down from the back of the transport truck in a torn Signal Corps uniform, squinting into the American sun, carrying 3 weeks of war on her skin. 3 weeks, 21 days. No bath, no clean water, no privacy. Just trains, ships holding pens, and the weight of her own body pressed into stale fabric until the smell became something you could almost see. In the summer of 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners of war were held on American soil. Most arrived broken by distance and logistics. But almost none arrived quite like this. What the medical staff found during her intake examination that afternoon would force a United States Army prisoner of war camp to change its procedures, rethink its standards, and confront a question that no field manual had prepared them for. How do you restore dignity to someone the war machine treated like cargo? Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historic events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community keeps these forgotten voices alive, and we are glad you are here. Her name does not appear in the history books. She was not a general, not a spy, not a resistance fighter. She was a telephone operator, a 21-year-old girl from somewhere in central Germany, who had been assigned to a military signals unit and who now stood on American soil in the worst state any member of the camp medical staff had ever processed. What happened next in that small wooden intake building in the American South would reveal something true and uncomfortable about what war does to the smallest, most basic human needs. And it begins not with a battle, not with a bomb, but with a smell that made hardened soldiers look away. To understand how she arrived in this condition, you have to go back further. Back to the moment the war began swallowing people whole. By 1943, the German military was hemorrhaging personnel on every front. The Eastern Front devoured divisions. North Africa collapsed. And in the scramble to fill every possible role, the Wehrmacht began pulling women into auxiliary positions in greater numbers than at any previous point in the war. These women, known as Helferinnen, served as telephone operators, radio technicians, clerks, and communication staff. They wore uniforms. They followed military orders. And when the end came, they were captured right alongside the men they had served beside. The processing systems built to handle prisoners of war had been designed with one image in mind. Columns of defeated soldiers, men in field gray, moving in lines from the battlefield to the holding pen to the transport ship. The systems were already strained. By mid-1944, the sheer volume of prisoners flowing from collapsing German positions in France and Italy was overwhelming every checkpoint, every depot, every ship manifest. Guards were exhausted. Paperwork ran weeks behind. Facilities built for hundreds were holding thousands. In this chaos, the specific needs of female prisoners were almost entirely invisible. There were no dedicated washing facilities for women at most transit camps. There were no female guards assigned to many of the holding depots. There were no protocols that distinguished between what a male prisoner needed to survive transport and what a female prisoner needed to survive it with any shred of human dignity intact. The system did not account for her. It simply moved her forward the way it moved everything. Fast, impersonal, and blind to what it was doing. She had been a telephone operator. Before the war, that would have meant a civilian switchboard somewhere, headset, on voice calm and professional, connecting calls across a city or a district. The war turned that skill into a military assignment. She sat in signal units routing communications for officers who never learned her name, keeping lines open during advances and retreats, staying at her post while the front moved and the world changed around her. She was 21 years old. In another version of her life, she would have been studying or working in a shop or thinking about what kind of future she wanted to build. Instead, she was in uniform when the surrender came. And once that happened, she became a number in a system that had no particular interest in who she had been before. The holding camp near the European port where she first arrived after capture was not designed for long stays. It was a processing point, a temporary pen between the battlefield and the ship. But the scale of German surrenders in that period meant that temporary became indefinite. Days stretched. The compound filled beyond its intended capacity. The single cold water tap in her section of the fenced enclosure served dozens of women and was rationed first for drinking, second for cooking, and last, if at all, for washing. She slept in her uniform every night, not because she wanted to, because there were no spare clothes, because nothing felt safe enough to remove. Because in a compound where the only separation between her and hundreds of strangers was a wire fence and an exhausted guard keeping every layer on, felt like the only protection she had left. Each morning she tried. She cupped cold water in her palms and washed her face and hands as best she could. She tried to work soap through her hair on the days when there was soap and enough water to rinse, but the grime accumulated faster than she could remove it. Sweat dried into the fabric of her uniform and was replaced by new sweat. The collar of her dress rubbed against her neck until the skin went raw. The straps of her bag dug furrows into her shoulders that deepened every day. Around her, the other prisoners were in similar states. There was a shared shame in the smell that hung over the compound, a kind of silent agreement, not to mention it, because mentioning it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant confronting how completely the system had stripped them of the ability to care for their own bodies, so no one talked about it. They talked about rumors instead, about which group would be sent to the docks next, about what America would be like, about whether anyone at home knew where they were. When her name was called for the transport group, she had no time to prepare. The order came, and the column formed, and the trucks were waiting, and the guards were shouting, and she grabbed her small bundle and moved with everyone else, because that was what you did. You moved when they told you to move, you stopped when they told you to stop, and you did not ask for time to wash. The docks smelled of salt and diesel and rust. The ship they boarded was a converted transport built for cargo and reconfigured to carry human beings with the minimum alterations required to keep them technically alive. The lower decks were packed. The air was thick. There were buckets for washing shared among more people than any bucket was meant to serve, and the trickle of usable water disappeared before it reached everyone. She found a corner. She pressed herself into it. She slept in fragments, waking to the creak of the ship and the sound of seasick men and the knowledge that she was moving further from everything she had ever known. Each day on the water added another layer to what she was already carrying. Another day of sweat and salt air, and the particular misery of an unwashed body in a confined space with no relief in sight. By the time the American coastline appeared, she had not had a real bath in over 2 weeks. By the time she passed through the port and boarded the train heading south, the count was pushing 3 weeks. By the time the truck carrying her pulled through the gates of the prisoner of war camp in the American South on that hot summer afternoon in 1944, 21 days had passed since she had last stood under running water. And everyone at the intake table knew it the moment the truck door opened. The medical officer at the gate had processed hundreds of incoming prisoners. He had seen men who had marched for days without food. He had seen soldiers with untreated wounds. He had seen the particular blankness in the eyes of men who had seen things they could not unfeel. He thought he had a sense of what the worst arrival looked like. Then he saw her. She stepped down from the truck slowly. Her boots had rubbed the skin of her ankles raw. Her hair was plastered to her scalp in dark matted strips. The collar of her Signal Corps uniform had worn a visible line of irritation around her neck. Her fingernails were rimmed with grime so thick and old it had begun to crack. And the smell. The layered, complex, heavy smell of 3 weeks of fear and sweat and ship and unwashed skin and fabric that had absorbed all of it and held it. The guard nearest the truck took that half-step backward. Another one, a young private from Georgia, turned his head to the side and pressed his lips together. A medic in the intake building looked up from his clipboard, and his expression changed in a way he could not quite hide before he smoothed it back into professionalism. She stood in the line with the male prisoners who had arrived on the same transport. She was shorter than most of them by a full head. She held herself as straight as she could under the weight of their eyes and her own exhaustion. One of the German prisoners behind her pulled his gaze away, embarrassed on her behalf. The American private at the door muttered something under his breath about why they had sent a girl with the men, but said it quietly enough that only the man beside him heard. She heard the word bath. She understood enough English for that one word to land clearly in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The medical officer made the decision quickly. He turned to the nurse, gave an instruction, and pointed toward the side room off the main intake hall. The nurse nodded. The guard stepped aside, and the girl was taken out of the main line away from the eyes of the other prisoners into a smaller, quieter space where a basin with running water caught the light from a propped open window and looked to someone who had not seen a proper sink in 3 weeks, like something out of a dream she had given up on having. The door closed. The noise of the camp became muffled, and in that small room with its metal examination table, and its cabinet of instruments and its basin of water, the true accounting of what 3 weeks without a bath had done to a 21-year-old German girl began. What the nurse and the medical officer found during that examination would not leave either of them easily. Raw patches where seams had pressed into skin for days without relief. Broken skin on her shoulders where the bag straps had dug in and crusted over. Hair that was not only heavy with grease, but threaded through with the small white specks that told experienced medical eyes exactly what they were dealing with. Lice. Common on transports, dangerous in a camp, requiring immediate treatment before she went anywhere near the other women in her assigned barracks. The girl watched their faces as they worked. She could read enough in their expressions to understand that what they were finding was bad. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She clenched her hands at her sides. She swallowed hard against the emotion that threatened to come up because crying in front of strangers in a foreign country, in a language she barely understood, in a condition she had had no power to prevent, felt like one humiliation she could not absorb on top of all the others. Then the nurse said the word again, bath, and gestured toward the door that led to the shower block. And the girl who had been a telephone operator, who had kept military lines open through advances and retreats, who had survived 3 weeks of transport in conditions the system had never stopped to examine, nodded once and followed. What happens when she finally steps under that water, and what the medical report written that afternoon will set in motion inside the camp's administrative offices, is what we turn to next. Because the shock in that intake room was not just personal, it was institutional. And the questions it forced the camp to ask about how prisoners, especially female prisoners, were being treated during transport, would ripple outward in ways that one 21-year-old girl standing under running water for the first time in 3 weeks could never have imagined. In part 2, we go inside the shower block, inside the medical report, and inside the quiet battle the camp staff fought with their own procedures after what they saw that afternoon. The war had rules about how prisoners were supposed to be treated. The question was whether anyone had been following them. She was under that shower for 11 minutes. The nurse timed it, and when she stepped out the towel she used came away gray. That was 4 weeks ago. The medical report filed that afternoon sat in the camp commandant's office for less than 24 hours before it moved upward through channels it was never supposed to reach. And what happened next inside the offices and meeting rooms of a United States Army prisoner of war camp in the summer of 1944 is a story about something that happens in every war, in every institution, in every system that has grown large enough to stop seeing the people inside it. It is a story about what happens when one inconvenient truth forces a machine to look at itself. The report was 4 pages long. It documented her physical condition on arrival in clinical language that somehow made it worse. Lice infestation confirmed. Dermal abrasions on shoulders, neck, and ankles, consistent with prolonged friction from unwashed clothing. Multiple sites of follicular inflammation on back and upper arms. Weight below recorded intake levels by 6 pounds. Duration since last confirmed hygiene access 21 days. The medical officer had written his final line without editorializing, but it landed like an indictment anyway. Patient arrived in a condition inconsistent with the minimum standards required under the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, 1929, Article 13. The commandant read it twice. Then he called his adjutant in and told him to find out how many female prisoners had arrived in the last 6 months and what the hygiene records looked like for their transport legs. The answer came back in 2 days. It was not good. Major Gerald Hartwell had been running prisoner processing administration for the camp's intake division since early 1943. He was 51 years old, a career officer, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had built functional systems under pressure and watched them work. When the commandant's inquiry landed on his desk, his first instinct was defensive. The transport system was not his responsibility. The European holding camps were not his responsibility. What happened on ships crossing the Atlantic was certainly not his responsibility. He said as much in the meeting that followed. The commandant, a quieter man named Colonel Addison Brace, let him finish. Then he set the 4-page medical report on the table between them and pushed it across. 21 days, Gerald, he said. She was 21 years old, and she had not had a bath in 21 days. 1 day for every year she has been alive. I want you to think about what that means in terms of what we are telling the world about how this camp operates. Hartwell picked up the report. He read it. He set it down. "The transport system is outside our jurisdiction, sir. We receive them as they arrive." "We receive them," Brace said. "And then we are responsible for them. And the first thing our medical staff found is that the system delivering them to us has been failing basic hygiene standards for female prisoners at minimum. What I need to know is whether we fix only what we see in front of us, or whether we say something about what produced it." Hartwell straightened in his chair. "With respect, Colonel raising a formal complaint about Allied transport procedures in the middle of a war over hygiene conditions for German auxiliary personnel is going to be received in Washington about as well as a screen door on a submarine." Brace looked at him for a long moment. "Then we start with what we can control. I want a new intake protocol for female arrivals on my desk within the week, and I want it to include hygiene assessment before any other processing step. Not after. Before." Hartwell left the meeting with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not create and told to solve it on a deadline. But here is what Hartwell did not know when he walked out of that office. Someone else had already been working on the same problem from a completely different angle. And she was not a major. She was not even an officer. Her name was Lieutenant Margaret Corwin, and she ran the women's section of the camp medical staff with the energy of someone who had been waiting for an institutional crisis to prove a point she had been making for 8 months. Corwin had arrived at the camp in late 1943. Within her first month, she had submitted 2 memos to the intake division flagging the lack of specific hygiene protocols for female prisoners. Both memos had been acknowledged, filed, and ignored. She had followed up 3 times. She had been told each time that the issue was noted and would be reviewed in the next quarterly assessment. The next quarterly assessment came and went. Nothing changed. When word reached her about the medical report, she appeared in Hartwell's office the following morning with a 12-page proposal she had written 9 months earlier and never been given the chance to present. Hartwell looked at the document. Then he looked at her. "You wrote this in October." "November," she said. "I updated it in February, and again in April." "Why didn't this reach the commandant?" She held his gaze. "I believe you were the one who signed the acknowledgement letters, Major." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In the history of this camp, those 4 seconds cost 8 months of inaction. What Corwin had proposed was not complicated. It did not require additional budget beyond the reallocation of existing resources. It required 3 things: a dedicated hygiene assessment step for female arrivals, before general processing a minimum access threshold for washing facilities at the point of intake, rather than after barrack assignment, and a formal communication protocol to flag when incoming female prisoners had gone beyond 72 hours without confirmed hygiene access during transport. 72 hours. She had chosen that number carefully. It was the outer limit of what the available medical literature considered manageable without significant risk of skin infection, lice propagation, and the psychological deterioration that comes from extended loss of bodily autonomy. The girl who had arrived after 21 days had exceeded that threshold by a factor of 7. Hartwell took the proposal to Brace that same afternoon. The new protocol went into effect 14 days later. The first test of it came when a transport of 38 prisoners arrived, including 4 female auxiliaries. All 4 were taken to hygiene assessment before the main intake line. 2 showed signs of early lice infestation. 1 had a skin infection on her forearms that required immediate treatment. None had been flagged by the transport manifest. Corwin stood in the intake room and watched the process move the way she had designed it to move. Then she went back to her office and added the results to a running log she had been keeping since her first memo in November 1943. 4 arrivals assessed. 2 infections caught before entering the general population. 0 cases entering the women's barracks without prior hygiene clearance. She wrote the numbers in ink. Small, precise, unambiguous. The kind of numbers that do not argue back. Meanwhile, the girl who had started all of this was 3 weeks into her life in the women's compound, and she knew nothing about the meetings, the memos, the protocol revisions, or the argument that had unfolded in offices she had never seen. What she knew was that the showers were accessible on a regular schedule. That the nurse had checked her scalp twice since her arrival and confirmed the lice treatment had worked. That the raw patches on her shoulders were healing. That she had clean clothes. She knew these things because she could feel them. In the way she moved through the morning roll call without flinching at the friction of her collar. In the way she could sit in the evening without the constant low-grade itch that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks. in the absence of shame that had clung to her as heavily as the smell itself. She did not know that her medical report had reached a colonel's desk. She did not know that a lieutenant's 8-month-old proposal had finally found an audience because of what the camp staff had seen when she stepped off that truck. She did not know that 4 other women arriving 2 weeks after her had been caught and treated before their conditions could worsen, because a protocol written with her unnamed situation in mind had been waiting for them. She knew only that she felt for the first time since her surrender like a person who was permitted to have a body. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. But the story does not end in the women's compound, and it does not end with a fixed protocol and a satisfied lieutenant. Because the report that Corwin sent up through channels did not stop at the camp commandant's desk. It went further. It went to the Regional Prisoner of War Administration office. And there it landed on the desk of a man who had very different ideas about what it meant and very different plans for what to do with it. His name was Brigadier General Howard Fisk. He had overseen prisoner logistics for the southeastern United States since mid-1943. He had processed more incoming German prisoners than almost anyone in the country. And when he read a report describing systemic hygiene failures in the transport of female prisoners, his first thought was not about the women. His first thought was about the ships. Because if the hygiene conditions on those transports were as bad as the report suggested, the problem was not just one girl and one camp. The problem was the entire pipeline. And fixing the pipeline meant confronting the people who ran it, people with rank and resources, and a long list of reasons why changing anything mid-war was impossible. Fisk picked up his telephone. He made 3 calls, and by the end of the week, a meeting had been scheduled that Hartwell Corwin and the camp commandant knew nothing about. What was said in that meeting, and what it would mean for the thousands of prisoners still moving across the Atlantic in conditions nobody had officially acknowledged as inadequate, is where Part 3 begins. Because when a general decides to pull a thread, the question is never whether something unravels. The question is, how much comes with it? Brigadier General Howard Fisk made 3 phone calls. By the end of the week, a meeting had been scheduled that would change everything. That was where Part 2 ended. What happened inside that meeting was not what anyone expected. Fisk did not come to defend the transport system. He came to dismantle the assumption that the transport system was a fixed variable. He came with numbers. Specific documented damning numbers pulled from medical intake records at 6 different prisoner of war camps across the southeastern United States. And what those numbers showed was not an isolated case. It was a pattern. Across those 6 camps in the 18 months between January 1943 and June 1944, female prisoners had arrived with confirmed lice infestations at nearly 3 times the rate of male prisoners arriving on the same transports. Skin infection rates on intake were 40% higher among women. Average documented time since last confirmed hygiene access was 11 days for male prisoners and 19 days for female prisoners. The gap was not accidental. It was structural. And now, a general with a telephone and a bad temper was about to make it someone else's problem to fix. This is where the story stopped being about one girl, one camp, and one medical report. And this is where it became something larger. The transport coordinators who received Fisk's findings did not take them well. The men who ran the logistics pipelines from European holding camps to American ports had built their systems under extraordinary pressure with inadequate resources, and they were not accustomed to being told that their extraordinary pressure was someone else's emergency. The first response from the Regional Transport Office came back in writing 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that translated roughly to conditions. Our regrettable resources are limited. No changes are currently operationally feasible. Fisk read the response. Then he wrote 4 words in the margin and sent it back. Try again. Howard Fisk. The second response took 4 days and ran to 11 pages. It acknowledged the hygiene gap. It proposed a review committee. It suggested a timeline of 6 to 9 months for implementing any changes to transport protocols. 6 to 9 months, while ships were still crossing the Atlantic. While women were still arriving at intake tables after 3 weeks without washing. Fisk did not convene a review committee. He convened a working group with a 30-day deadline, staffed it with people who had actually run intake operations, rather than people who had administrated them from a distance, and put Lieutenant Margaret Corwin on it as the medical representative from the camp level. She was the only person in the room who had written the solution down 8 months before anyone was ready to listen to it. The working group's output was a single-page field directive. It required every transport carrying female prisoners to designate a minimum hygiene window of 30 minutes per prisoner every 72 hours. It required holding camps to document and certify hygiene access before releasing prisoners for onward transport. And it required receiving camps to record hygiene gap duration on intake forms so that the data could be tracked and reviewed at the regional level. 1 page, 4 requirements, 30 days to produce it. Corwin brought a copy back to the camp and gave it to the commandant without comment. He read it. He looked at her. "You wrote something like this 9 months ago," he said. "Yes, sir." "Is this better than what you wrote?" She thought for a moment. "It has a general's signature on it," she said. "So in practical terms, yes." The directive went into effect in September 1944. By November, the intake records at the camp showed a measurable shift. The average documented hygiene gap for incoming female prisoners had dropped from 19 days to 4. Lice infestation rates on arrival fell by more than half within 2 intake cycles. Skin infection cases requiring immediate treatment before barrack assignment dropped from a significant minority of female arrivals to a small fraction. The girl who had arrived in July, the one whose medical report had set everything in motion, was by this point 3 months into the rhythm of camp life. She had adapted to the routines, the way people adapt to anything they cannot change, by finding the small controllable things and holding on to them. She washed her clothes on Tuesdays. She braided her hair on Sunday mornings with another woman from her barracks who had been a school teacher before the war. She traded English words with a young American guard who was trying to learn German from a pocket dictionary he carried in his breast pocket. She did not know about the working group. She did not know about the field directive. She did not know that her 11 minutes under a shower in July had produced a paper trail that ended with a general's signature and a 1-page document circulating through transport commands across the southeastern United States. She knew that other women were arriving in better condition than she had. She noticed this. She said nothing about it to anyone but in the evenings when new prisoners came into the women's compound, and she saw them standing straighter, smelling cleaner, looking less like people who had been moved like freight across an ocean. She felt something she could not quite name. Not pride. She had done nothing deliberate. Something quieter. The recognition that her worst moment had somehow produced someone else's better one. In December 1944, the war in Europe began moving toward its conclusion with a speed that made the prisoner logistics system strain in entirely new directions. The Battle of the Bulge sent German casualties in both directions simultaneously. Allied prisoners were liberated. German prisoners were captured in new numbers. The transport pipeline that Fisk's working group had spent 3 months trying to reform was suddenly carrying twice the volume it had been designed for. The field directive held. Not perfectly, not everywhere, not for every prisoner on every transport, but the documentation requirement meant that failures were now visible instead of 9 months. What it means that the threshold between acceptable and unacceptable was invisible until it arrived in a specific body with a specific smell on a specific July afternoon in 1944. That question does not have a clean answer. But it is the question that Part 4 sits inside. Because the story of this camp, this girl, and this directive did not end with a signature or a stabilized statistic. It ended with something harder to measure and more important to understand. And that is where we go next. The question Part 3 left open was this. What does it mean that it took one specific body, one specific smell, one specific July afternoon to make a system see what a lieutenant had been documenting for 8 months? That question does not have a comfortable answer, but it has a true one. And the truth of it lives in what happened to the people at the center of this story, after the war ended, in what the field directive they produced became. Over the following decades, and in one final detail that most accounts of prisoner of war administration in the Second World War have never stopped to examine. The girl arrived in July 1944 with 21 days of war on her skin. A medical report moved upward through channels. A general made 3 phone calls. A lieutenant's 8-month-old proposal finally found a signature. By February 1945, the average hygiene gap for female prisoners arriving at the camp had dropped from 19 days to under 72 hours. That is where Part 3 ended. This is where the story becomes something more than a story about a camp directive. This is where it becomes a story about what survives. Lieutenant Margaret Corwin was reassigned in March 1945 as the camp population began its drawdown ahead of repatriation. She went to a military hospital in Virginia, where she spent the final months of the war, processing returning Allied prisoners of war men who had survived German camps and Japanese camps, and the particular damage that extended captivity does to a human body. She brought her documentation habits with her. She tracked hygiene gap durations on intake. She flagged cases that exceeded 72 hours. She wrote the numbers in ink small and precise, the same way she had been writing them since November 1943. When the war ended, Corwin left military service and returned to civilian nursing in Ohio. She did not receive a commendation for the field directive. She did not receive public recognition of any kind. Her name does not appear in any published account of prisoner of war administration during the Second World War. The two-sentence letter from Fisk's office remained the only official acknowledgement she ever received that her work had produced anything beyond the work itself. She continued nursing until 1971. People who knew her in her later years described her as methodical, precise, and unusually attentive to patient dignity in ways that struck younger colleagues as almost philosophical. She did not, as far as anyone recorded, talk about her wartime service in any detail. She had done a thing that mattered. She had watched it matter in real time. That appeared to be enough for her. Brigadier General Howard Fisk retired in 1952 after a post-war career in logistics administration that was distinguished but not celebrated. He was the kind of officer who made systems work better without generating the kind of dramatic output that produces biographies. In his retirement memoir, a privately printed document, shared only with family, he devoted 3 pages to the prisoner of war hygiene directive. He described it as the most direct line he had ever drawn between a piece of paper and a human outcome. He wrote that the girl whose intake report had started the process was, in his estimation, as reliable in a way they had not been before. When a ship arrived with prisoners who had gone longer than 72 hours without documented hygiene access, the receiving camp flagged it. The flag went into the record. The record went to the regional office. And the regional office, for the first time, had a mechanism for seeing the pattern instead of only the individual case. Corwin tracked the numbers through the winter. By February 1945, the average documented hygiene gap for female prisoners arriving at the camp had stabilized at under 72 hours, for the first time since the camp had opened. The threshold she had chosen in her original November 1943 memo. The outer limit before significant medical risk was now the operating standard for the entire regional system. She did not receive a commendation for this. She received a letter of recognition from Fisk's office that acknowledged her contribution to the working group's output. It was 2 sentences long. She filed it and went back to work. The Commandant, Colonel Brace, wrote a longer note in his personal log that winter. He described the arc from the July intake examination to the December field directive as an example of how institutional inertia breaks. Not through dramatic confrontation, he wrote, but through the accumulation of specific documented undeniable evidence that the current state is unacceptable. He credited the medical officer who had written the initial report, the lieutenant who had been writing the same report for 8 months before anyone read it, and the general who had decided that a response time of 6 to 9 months was not a response at all. He did not name the girl. He did not know her name. She had arrived as a prisoner, number been processed under that number, and would eventually be repatriated under it. But he wrote 1 sentence that came closest to acknowledging her without knowing it. The catalyst, he wrote, was a single case so visible in its failure that it became impossible to look away. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending, and the prisoner of war camps in the United States were beginning the long process of preparing for repatriation. Files were reviewed. Medical records were updated. And somewhere in the administrative building of the camp in the American South, the 4-page medical report from July 1944 was pulled from its folder cross-referenced with the field directive it had helped produce and filed in the permanent record. The girl, now 22 years old, sat in her barracks on the afternoon she heard that Germany had surrendered and felt the particular disorientation of an ending that brought no clear beginning. The war she had been captured in was over. The country she had served, however reluctantly, was defeated. The future was a word without content. But she was clean. She had been clean for 9 months. She had regular access to washing facilities, clean clothing, adequate food, and medical care. These were not small things. She knew they were not small things, in a way she had not known before. July 1944, before a truck door slammed and a guard took a half-step backward, and a medical officer tightened his jaw and decided to change the procedure. The story of what happened to her after repatriation what she returned to in a destroyed and divided Germany. What she made of the years that followed belongs to a chapter that history did not record by name. But the story of what her arrival produced, the report, the protocol, the working group, the field directive, the 9-month reduction in hygiene gaps across a regional prisoner of war system, that story has an ending that is worth knowing. Because the final question is not what happened to the girl. The final question is what it means that it took her condition to make the system see what Lieutenant Corwin had been documenting for 8 months. What it means that a general had to pick up a telephone before a one-page solution could travel 30 days. Responsible for the field directive as anyone who had signed it. He did not know her name. He called her the Catalyst and let that stand. Colonel Addison Brace stayed in contact with the camp's former medical officer for several years after the war. In one letter from 1948, he wrote that the July 1944 intake case remained in his memory, the clearest example he had witnessed of how institutional systems fail not through malice, but through the simple human tendency to keep doing what has always been done until something makes it impossible to look away. He was not describing a scandal. He was describing something more ordinary and more dangerous than a scandal. He was describing the default state of every large organization in history. The medical officer himself, whose name the records preserve, but whose privacy this account will respect, went into private practice in Tennessee after the war. He kept a copy of the 4-page intake report in a folder he never showed anyone. His daughter found it after his death in 1983. She did not know what it was. She kept it because his handwriting was in the margins and it seemed important to him. It was. Now, we turn to what the directive itself became. Because the one-page field document that Corwin's proposal and Fisk's telephone calls produced did not disappear when the camps closed. In 1949, the United States military began the process of codifying its prisoner of war handling procedures in preparation for what everyone understood after Korea began in 1950 would be further conflicts requiring detention operations. The hygiene documentation requirement that had been introduced as a field directive in September 1944 was incorporated into formal prisoner handling regulations as a standing requirement. The 72-hour threshold that Corwin had chosen based on available medical literature in 1943 became a codified standard. It appeared in training materials. It appeared in inspection checklists. It appeared in the evaluation criteria used to assess detention facilities during the Korean War. During the Korean conflict, American prisoner of war camps processed prisoners under conditions that were by multiple accounts significantly more attentive to basic hygiene than the conditions that had produced the July 1944 report. This was not inevitable. It was the product of a documented standard that had been written into regulation. The standard existed because a general had made 3 phone calls. The calls happened because a medical report had reached a colonel's desk. The report existed because a medical officer had decided that a private examination and an immediate bath were the right response to what he saw stepping off a truck. One decision correctly made inside a hot wooden building in the American South in the summer of 1944 traveled forward through time and manifested in the treatment of prisoners in a different war on a different continent 6 years later. This is how institutional change actually works. Not through speeches or policy documents in isolation, but through the accumulation of specific decisions made by specific people in specific moments, which then become the baseline that the next generation inherits. The lesson that Corwin's story carries is not the comfortable lesson about speaking truth to power and being heard. She spoke truth to power for 8 months and was not heard. The lesson is harder than that. The lesson is that good documentation maintained without bitterness and without stopping is a form of institutional patience that sometimes outlasts the indifference it confronts. She wrote the same analysis in November 1943, February 1944, and April 1944. She filed it 3 times into silence. And then in July 1944, the silence ended, not because she had finally been persuasive enough, but because reality had made the silence untenable. The broader lesson, the one that connects this story to every organization and every era, is about the cost of the 72-hour threshold existing as a standard practice instead of a written requirement. When the threshold was only practice, it was invisible. It depended on individual judgment, individual attention, individual willingness to notice. When it became a written standard, it became enforceable. The difference between a good practice and a written standard is the difference between something that exists when someone remembers it and something that exists regardless of who remembers. Other stories from the Second World War carry the same structural lesson in different forms. The development of blood banking, standardized field surgery protocols, and systematic delousing procedures for returning veterans all followed the same pattern. An observable problem, a proposed solution. Institutional resistance, a crisis that made resistance untenable, and then a standard that outlasted the crisis by decades. The war produced an enormous number of innovations born not from inspiration, but from the point at which doing nothing became more expensive than changing. The girl who was the catalyst for all of this was repatriated in the summer of 1945. She traveled back to Europe on a ship where washing facilities were scheduled and documented. She arrived in a Germany that was physically devastated and politically transformed beyond anything she had grown up understanding as permanent. What she found there, whether her family was intact, whether her town still stood, whether the future she reconstructed for herself had room in it for what she had experienced, the records do not say. What the records do say is this. In the permanent files of the camp where she had been processed, her intake report was cross-referenced with the field directive it had helped produce. Someone at some point before the files were archived had drawn a single line in pencil connecting the two documents in the index. It is the only annotation of its kind in the entire archive. Whoever drew that line understood something about cause and effect that the official record was not designed to capture. They captured it anyway in pencil, in the margin, in the space between what the system recorded and what actually happened. That pencil line is the final detail most accounts of this period never stop to find. It is not dramatic. It is not a revelation. It is simply someone whose name we do not know, deciding that the connection between one woman's worst 3 weeks and a policy that improved the treatment of prisoners across an entire regional system was worth marking, even if only in pencil, even if only in a file that almost no one would ever read. This is what survives from the story of the 21-year-old German girl who arrived at a United States prisoner of war camp in the summer of 1944 after 3 weeks without a bath. Not her name, not her face, not the details of her life before or after the camp. What survives is the change she catalyzed without intending to the standard she produced by simply arriving in a condition that made looking away impossible, and a pencil line drawn by an unknown hand in the margin of an archive that connects what she suffered to what was fixed because of it. From a telephone operator in a Signal Corps unit captured and transported as cargo across an ocean, her story produced a field directive, a codified hygiene standard, and a measurable reduction in the suffering of prisoners who came after her in 2 separate wars. She did not set out to change anything. She set out to survive. And in surviving and arriving and standing at that intake table in a state that no protocol had anticipated, she forced a system to become slightly more human than it had been the day before. The most important changes in history are rarely made by the people history remembers. They are made by the people who arrived at the moment when the cost of not changing finally exceeded the cost of changing, and who happened to be present and visible and impossible to ignore. She was impossible to ignore. And because she was, things were different afterward. That is enough. That has always been enough.